who face eternity easily forget what a lifetime means, what an ending means.
You know it doesn't have to be this way.
No, Kunavine, it does. They need me.
Well, welcome to something of a bonus release. I'm trying something here, End of Dragons Daily 11. Now, I do not plan on making a habit out of this, but I want to see how you guys take to 2 episodes in one day. Now, I'll pace these out a little bit, but with the news from, I say news, it's not really news, but with the statement from Guild Chat talking about how the expansion might have affected the Icebrood Saga, and then all the speculation we did with that, we kind of had a big discussion there today, but there's just so many messages that I think are interesting takes, and I want to respond to, and they're going to drift into the background if I don't do it now. So I'm going to do a second one, and I want to see, you know, what the viewership does, really. I want to see what the likes are like. I want to see what the comments are like. I want to see what the viewership is. Can you guys actually handle 2 of these in one day? Because if you can, and in fact, if this is of a benefit to the series, I really do think that we could sometimes filter in a double release every now and then. But with the videos themselves being bite-sized, so people can pick them as and when they choose. So a bit of an experiment here, mostly because there's so many different things that I want to talk about. So let's run on in. This is kind of a hodgepodge, a miscellaneous melting pot of different ideas and topics and responses. Let's start out. Now, the first message here, I'll keep anonymous. It actually came from Patreon. Now, I was really surprised to see this. Usually, as far as Patreon stuff's concerned, we have these big special episodes, and I want to do something extra for people there. And as we pick things up and we continue through January, we'll be looking at that. But this is really very specifically in response to End of Dragons Daily, so we'll go through it. The message reads, "Hey WP, I noticed in a video you asked about some software developers to reach out to discuss their experience while working from home. Now, this is very relevant because, as we mentioned in the other upload today, you know, all of End of Dragons might be a from-home made expansion. I thought I'd take this opportunity to reach out and do that. I'm a software developer for Sky, a media company, which is a relatively large company. It's funny you explain that. I mean, here in the UK, I'm very familiar with that. Anyway, my experience of lockdown may well differ from the average person at ArenaNet, due simply to the reason that most of the projects within my team tend to be done by a single person, so there isn't that much collaboration to begin with. That aside, I feel it hasn't really affected my job that much. I can do everything at home that I could at the office. There were some teething problems early on, some networking issues which stopped us being able to easily reach everything, like servers that we needed to. The main advantage of work from home is the flexible hours. Generally, I get my work done early, but I leave my chat applications open, so if anyone needs my help, I can reply any time of the day. One big disadvantage, however, is it's definitely hard to collaborate. Now, this is what worries me a bit for End of Dragons, because I do view video game development as a very collaborative process, or in general, the way that ArenaNet does it, certainly. I do find sometimes a face-to-face meeting would be far quicker and more efficient use of time. So I think ideally I would want to go to the office every now and then post-COVID for some face-to-face meetings, probably once every fortnight. My team did start doing weekly gaming sessions to keep in touch. Anyway, to sum up, it's been a bit harder to have meetings virtually and harder to collaborate. You cannot just go to a colleague's desk and ask a quick question. You have to send a message and wait. They may be busy or not checking messages, etc. But overall, not much change to actual work projects. I would probably prefer to work remotely in the future. Feel free to ping me if you have any more questions. I do hope that we will see a shift, generally speaking, and we're going a bit further than End of Dragons. We're talking about just general corporate culture at the moment. After COVID, giving people that little bit of extra freedom. I remember the last giant office space that I worked in, a lot of people, particularly in upper management, it felt like, really utilized their work from home options very often. You know, security is a big question and there are kinks to work out, but I hope we do move in this direction. What I think will have to happen more than anything else, specifically attesting to this disadvantage of having to wait on messages where face-to-face is more efficient, is if there's kind of a cultural shift, people are really readily available. Like if you're at work and you're showing that, you know, it's the working hours, you're supposed to be there, a big part of what it means to be an employee is to be accessible. And hopefully over the next 5-10 years, if we see that, you know, this big downside will kind of go away. Because in theory, having to do face-to-face, even if you're in the same office building, should be slower than just being able to shoot someone a quick message, get a ping, and get a response. You know, if it's within that 9 to 5 window or whatever you like. Generally speaking, as an individual, this is something I'm terrible with, truly, and something I really need to work on. So it'll be interesting to see how we go forwards. Anyway, specifically for End of Dragons, I think there's a lot of factors that are kind of contaminating it at the moment, and it does worry me. I think it just in terms of ArenaNet is not the only studio that's been affected by COVID and all this stuff. Might mean that the competition's a little bit weaker too, so maybe not all to despair. But as a fan, you know, I understand people being a little bit concerned here. Fun comment / proposal from Cass here is never going to really fit into one of our daily topics. By the way, do you think ArenaNet will expand the existing map art to fill in all of the Cantha? Or could they include a separate tab for it on the side? I am fine with it either way. I was just thinking that if they want to fit it onto the existing map art, there would have to be a lot of other unrelated blank areas to fill as well. Yeah, so we're kind of talking about the aspect ratio of the world map. The way that Guild Wars 1 delivered its new campaigns, it just gave you separate maps entirely, and that led to a weird world that I think kind of got built almost by accident, where it's very, very vertical, rather than being a big square or being, you know, particularly wide. You might even expect it to be a kind of a wider world map when you look at stuff like the Mercator projection and how we view our own globe. With ArenaNet's development of these regions, it was very weird, and it was only really when Guild Wars 2 came around that they plotted all that stuff onto the globe, and suddenly we had all these supercontinents and other areas way off in the distance we've never seen depicted. You saw, obviously, with Path of Fire, they expanded the map twice around that era, and both times they went further south, they also went further east. They chose not to expand west. A little bit weird, maybe. I still want to see that coast of just beyond the side of Maguma. I think that would be very cool. And so what do I think they'll do with Cantha? My preferred angle here is that we do not get a separate tab. Separate tabs just feel so disconnected to me and strange, and that works if it's like a part of the story. Like, you know, the Realm of Torment definitely deserves to have its own tab, but I always feel a bit disconnected unless I can properly, like, scroll in and out, a bit like, say, how WoW does it, where it's kind of separate tabs, really, whether you're viewing Kalimdor or the full world. You know, it's kind of a different map that you end up clicking into, but you kind of get that sense of how everything aligns together. I don't want to lose that sense. You know, I played just for a bit of fun recently, Maple Story, and that game is so heavily updated now and has so many weird different maps. There's a compounding problem with that format of MMO as a side-scrolling MMO, which is actually a format I'm very interested in. But how they deliver the world map, they have all these little cells that it's hard to tell how everything connects. I don't like it. So what I would want in Guild Wars 2 is Cantha to be properly connected, and if that means they have to expand to the sides a ton, then expand to the sides a ton, you know? All that's going to do is get people more interested about those areas of the world. Yeah, you guys watching this channel and participating in a lot of the discussion, you probably know about the other areas of the world. You've probably seen several of my videos about that over time, but a lot of the general Guild Wars 2 players, and even those that are going to be new as End of Dragons comes out, they don't know about that stuff, so put it in their in-game for them to see. And this time I would say, yeah, keep going east, show us more of that supercontinent or whatever, but pad it out by going west as well. Do it, give us that Maguma coast, and in that way you can kind of go a bit 50-50 and you can squeeze Cantha in. I think it will still be generally a more vertical map than a horizontal map or whatever. It won't really be a square. But I think that works, and I'd be very, very happy to see it all connected. They may even have a bit of an advantage with the battle isles as well, like if the battle isles are a little bit more offset than we expect. Because as far as I remember, aside from like the Derman Priory floor and the Order of Whispers globe and the guild decorations and all that stuff, aside from those, we don't really get a great sense of where the battle isles exactly are. And I mean, you could take those things I just listed as explicit canon, but I actually kind of think of them as a little 50-50, especially like the Derman Priory floor, which is the same art but has islands named after devs. I mean, they're not going to keep that, right? So I would expect some kind of soft tweak to that, and in that case maybe they can shuffle some other stuff around, you know. And we see as well, and I kind of hate this, but as far as Guild Wars 2 has been concerned, they've always been very loose and fancy free in terms of messing with the world art. Like, so many of these living world releases, when a new environment becomes available to explore and it actually gets unfogged on the map, the geography is completely different. Like, probably the worst example of that, if not the introduction of South Sun, is when Bitterfrost came in, and suddenly the whole idea of where the water is that leads into Frostgorge Sound got totally messed with. You know, they don't seem to care much. And anyway, what I'm trying to say is, because they don't care much, maybe they can shift the battle isles over. I do expect the battle isles to become available at some time during the End of Dragons era, and, you know, you can be using that space off on the sides, because it's going to look weird if they give us all this space and ultimately there's still just like a little narrow corridor or rectangle in the middle that we've actually been playing on. You know, you can offset things a bit, and yeah, it just leads to more happiness and speculation, doesn't it? Now, if we view End of Dragons as the end of the road, Despite the fact the devs said they still have stories to tell in Guild Wars 2, if the truth it is the end of the road because, you know, Project 3 is going to be a thing, then it is going to be weird having all this art everywhere that will never be used. But in that way, it's just going to be more of the same. Guild Wars has always been in a place where there's art that's never been used, both in the first and second game. If you think of End of Dragons as the end of the road, guys, you got to think that would mean no Wizard's Tower for this game in the franchise, maybe another one. That might mean that the Bandit Brisbane Bridge never actually gets a place beyond it. There's a lot of ramifications to that. Sound Pilgrim says, I agree that we can have our cake and eat it too for the Jade Sea being melted and also not melted in some places. In my opinion, the entirety of the effects of the Jade Wind disappearing is kind of lame. It's a cataclysmic event that completely transformed a region of the world. I would be sad to see it leave no scars. I agree with you. You know, Ascalon is so compelling in Guild Wars 2 because the wall is still there, and the ghosts are there, and the brand is there, and the Syrian crystals are there. Like, there's all these layers all built up, and then the char on top and all the stuff that they've built. It's brilliant. And Cantha should have something similar, I think. One other thing, I've never seen this discussed, but couldn't a certain amount of the standing water in the Jade Sea be attributed to rainfall? I know it's a bit of a boring theory, but I've never seen it mentioned, and it seems like it'd be a thing. Now, actually, yes, I had that on mind when I mentioned that 2 days ago now. Because, in fact, one of the maps, you got to remember in Guild Wars 1, there was no day-night cycle, there were no weather systems or anything like that. And Guild Wars 2 does have that, by the way, since POF. There is dynamic rain in some areas of the desert, and I'd love to see more of that with End of Dragons, for what it's worth. Anyway, there is a map, there's a couple of areas where it's just always raining. And you don't really get to see it super in on the Jade areas, but it definitely is on the coasts. So, yes, I think that a lot of it can be rain, there can be puddles from that. I don't know whether the devs really want to look into it too much because, as far as I know, and, you know, maybe I'm slightly off with the real-world science here, but if you have no way for rainwater to drain, like, if you have really hot, baked mud, like, over a flat plain, where when it rains, it can't drain into the soil because it's just too hard, that creates, like, insane mudslides and flooding, like, just the worst kind of stuff. And what would that mean for the Jade Sea? Are there flash flood potentials? Or do the frozen waves in place kind of create, like, drainage basins? But, I mean, the ripples we're talking about there aren't really at certain elevations. I don't know, this is where real-world geography starts really messing with things. And we're talking about something that's ultra-high fantasy and, you know, silly, maybe we weren't supposed to scrutinize that much. It's funny to think of, though, especially in the context of the Deep Sea Dragon being a threat this expansion, and maybe flooding places. You know, I talked about a fire in Kaineng before. What if they do a story where the Deep Sea Dragon is just flooding everything, like absolutely washing everyone away? And again, if you think of End of Dragons as the true end of the road, then ArenaNet can really mess with Cantha and do some crazy stuff, because if it's the end, they're not selling you the idea of living in Cantha as your lifestyle MMO. They're just giving you something to play with before we all move on. And in that world, you know, maybe they really, really want to mess with it, and they can be kind of disastrous with what they go for. Next, Silver says, I just don't get some people. Jade, by all intentions, is just a type of jewel stone. It can't melt. It's not ice, and the whole idea it would exhibit the same properties as such is fundamentally flawed. And if you're trying to wish in a believable way in which it could supposedly melt, you can't. Shiro called forth the power of Dwayna, but realistically speaking, she is the source of the magic, not Shiro. He merely acted as a conduit and channeled the magic, and his death doesn't suddenly give reason to assume the result of said magic, which would simply disappear in his absence, and not how magic generally works in fantasy. Wow, I got so much I need to respond to here. Okay, first of all, this is a baffling comment to me in a way, because in the first half you seem to have no understanding that we're dealing with a fantasy property, and in the second half you argue how general fantasy works to, like, substantiate your point. Like, it's very weird. Obviously, yeah, real world jade can't melt, it's a mineral, but this isn't the real world. This is magical jade created by a magical event in a magical universe that turned water into jade. So the idea that jade can turn back into water, following the logic of the universe itself, not real world logic, but this universe's logic, that totally works. People are not wrong to think that. Same with the friggin' Echo-Vowed Forest, that the trees might no longer be stone after a while. And the fact is, even if we do only in-universe analysis for this topic, it's kind of tricky because it's not consistent anyway. Like, why did the Jade Winds turn the Jade Sea into Jade, but the forest into stone. Surely both should have turned into jade, but no, we had jade and amber, or amber/stone. Like, none of it's really that consistent. It's just however ArenaNet want to write it, and what seems perhaps logical. So that moves me to the next thing. I've actually been making a mistake in Christ knows how many videos now. I want to correct it here, because this comment actually got me to go back and read the movement of the world, because I really wanted to see exactly what the devs had said. And here's the mistake. It's not in the movement of the world that these places are reverting. It's not. What the movement of the world talks more about is the emperors to follow and the isolationism and so on, and xenophobia. Oh, by the way, I had a million comments on this and the idea of politics in games, which maybe we could do a special on. I think some people would be leery of that, but I don't know. I think it's an interesting topic. Anyway, it's not in the movement of the world, but have no fear, I'm not wrong. The devs did say this. It's actually the Eye of the North manuscript. So in Eye of the North, they talk a little bit about what's going on, and there's one paragraph out of 4 that is most relevant. Once again, massive credit and thanks to the wiki contributors for stuff like this. So here's what it says. Over the past few years, life has begun to spring up in the Echovald Forest. And when they say over the past few years, they mean following the end of the Factions campaign. Faction ended, and then it's a couple of years before Eye of the North starts. Okay, so that's what they're talking about. As soon as Shiro is dead, they say this. Over the past few years... Well, not dead, but... Well, yes, dead, because he did a Voldemort, didn't he? He came alive, and then we killed him. Over the past few years, life has begun to spring up in Echovald Forest, as many areas have seen new growth take hold. Some even claim to have seen a change in the Jade Sea, small pools of water forming or even waves moving beneath the frozen surface. But these reports are unsubstantiated rumors at best. So look, you can take that last sentence, that sentence is exactly what we really need now, 260 years later, to, you know, pretend that none of that actually matters and that, in fact, it just stayed frozen the whole time. But obviously, if at the time of Eye of the North, the studio put this comment in here, and if you look at the timescales, it was their intention at one point to start reverting this stuff to basically make it that Factions, what we did in Factions had an impact. Now, it kind of did have an impact anyway. We stopped the Affliction. That was the story of the Factions campaign, but there is this side of it too. I'm pretty sure that the Winds of Change Beyond campaign also will have talked more about this, and there'll be hints and stuff. I'd like to do an abridged series of that, just as I did an abridged Core Cantha thing. I'd like to do an abridged series at some point going forwards, and maybe we'll see those there, or people can drop comments down there that have gone digging for it if it's there. So yes, there is every chance they can go either way they want, but I do want to be clear that that's the real information. Now let's talk a bit about Shiro and the idea that, well, just because Shiro's gone, why would it change? It's not even Shiro's magic. I like that idea a lot. It's not consistent again. I mean, I think what the devs were going with was that Dwayna is the goddess of life, and you know, the ceremony they were doing was like the harvest thing. It was about, you know, blessing, I guess, Cantha for better crops or something. They never really divulged much, but I like the idea that they had this big festival in which they helped produce the bread basket and feed the nation every year. And that goes awry, so instead of bringing new life and helping all the crops and being very bountiful, the reverse happens, and all the life gets sucked away. And you can definitely see that with the Echovald Forest. It all turns to stone. There is no life there anymore, in theory. I mean, some things did survive, they just went crazy. Some things survived, and they were just genuinely pissed, like the Wardens. And then maybe something similar with the Jade Sea. Back to Shiro, it's a good point, but there are things that muddy the water, like how Revenants aren't channeling Dwayna when they're in Legendary Assassin stance. They're channeling Shiro. So, you know, you have to assume at some point there was a transfer of power, you know, from Dwayna into the Emperor and then into Shiro at the point of assassination, and that he is somewhat connected with it. You know, what are we saying here? That the Revs that are using Jade Winds and stuff with their skills are actually channeling in this long daisy chain all the way up to Dwayna. But we've never known Dwayna herself to be especially Jade associated or stone or amber associated, have we? She's the goddess of air and life. Maybe you want to disregard the skills entirely, and I think that's a kind of a good idea. I don't think that the Elite Specialization team were thinking about any of this when they produced that stuff back with Heart of Thorns. And the other point to make as well is maybe, I mean, didn't Shiro turn to Jade as he died in that last moment? There's like a visual beat you can see in the cutscene. I'm sure that back with Factions, they just did that for the poetry of it, but maybe that means that the Revs now get Jade skills because he was encased in Jade when he died finally and he wasn't allowed to be an envoy or whatever. I don't know. There's so much going on here. I mean, maybe this is just envoy influence. These are the niggling things about this franchise and this universe that make me think, you know what? Don't worry too much about it. They'll do what they want to do. Let's have our cake and eat it too. Ravona says, it might not make much sense in the lore, but the Thief's End of Dragons elite spec being a pirate or something could go along with the war theme. It would have the potential to be cool if done right. So yeah, a pirate, I think, works very, very, very well. I don't think it necessarily has to be with a sailing system or anything like that. I actually envisage a lot of different ways you can do a pirate. You can have swashbucklers, you can have corsairs that are like with Saida. You can do a lot of stuff, and, you know, maybe this is the perfect opportunity. You guys might remember before POF came out, I think it was, we did a little competition where I had people design pirate elite specs, and we had a ton of them. You know, you can have like a siren thing for the Mesmer. They could really, really lean into the water stuff. I wouldn't be surprised. We'll get to some elite spec discussion as topics on this show as we go along. And obviously this is stuff I'm doing with boots. Hardy83 says, unless they can upgrade the engine to have waves and currents, I don't think it'll be that interesting to have large open water spaces. Yeah, a lot of people say that the combat is what they need to change. I actually think the combat is unsalvageable. I'd like to see more going on with the water too. Currents and pockets of air that we can travel around in. And the truth is, I think that just the way that Guild Wars is coded at the moment, the handling of the water, it would need to gut and change and tweak so much stuff. It's not likely to happen. In favor of the whole waves thing, though, we have seen them doing fun stuff. Where, like at Draconis Mons, you have the waves. Look at like around Sandswept Isles, where you're skimmering along and dolphins come up with you, or sharks try to bite you out of the water. They've done some stuff, and you know those are examples of some of the really cool things we saw in Season 4. Again, why I think that season was so high quality, and people forget about that stuff too quickly. End of Dragons could do any of it. Ben Smith says the Kurzik bias when talking about ergos. This suction. I missed this. Now, this is another side of End of Dragons. I think what's really dissolved away, and people are forgetting about factions back in the day, is it was called factions because really what they were trying to do was appeal to the Horde versus Alliance thing that was going on with WoW. I mean, that's how I see it anyway. And people really went into it. They picked their tribe and they embraced it in a fun way, and they kind of went at each other's throats. You know, you had the Kurdicks and the Suxons and all these stupid, edgy teenagers debating over who was better. And they were actually fun lore debates. You know, I was always more of a Luxon. More recently, I really like the idea of the culture and the people in the Echervald Forest, actually. But, you know, this was cool, and I would like to see End of Dragons do a bit more. I feel like the studio is just, I don't know, maybe it's at odds with the Guild Wars 2 philosophy. People like throwing that word Care Bear and stuff around, but I think Guild Wars 2 has always really prided itself on making people not antagonistic to each other in PvE as much as possible. So maybe they might shy away from it now, but I love that stuff, and it was kind of a blast from the past to see there. And I have an Ergos bias, by the way, because the Sylvari connection in Guild Wars 2 is very compelling, and because that was really one of my first experiences of true MMO endgame, and I love the format of the Ergos Warren, still to this day. Inks says, fractals, aren't they kind of dead? Speaking of endgame, we got one in 2020, and yes, I know the pandemic, but even before that, there is clearly a drop-off going on. I think you might be right. Endgame is just such a tricky thing because ArenaNet built such a shoddy game at its core in terms of teaching its players what's compelling about its combat and getting them invested in it and to relish in the challenge, that it's very, very hard to sell endgame systems to them. And they've tried it multiple times. I think they really wanted to try the strike thing with Icebrood Saga, and then they realized they couldn't go very far with Icebrood Saga, and they all had to go over to End of Dragons instead, as was pretty much confirmed with this guild chat statement. So then strikes have kind of been thrown away. Strikes are very fractal-ish as well, if you think about it, in terms of quick little islands, quick little encounters. They're just really, really distilled down to one fight. And I think there could have been a lot of good there. Hopefully End of Dragons will pick it back up. But I'm very curious about endgame systems, and actually I'm going to put that on the floor for the next topic. What do you guys think? A return of dungeons? Will they be fractals there? Are they going to actually look back at raids? How can they reconfigure the stuff that they've already got? If End of Dragons is the true end of the road, if you're one of those believers, And I'm not saying I'm entirely one of those, by the way, but if you are, consider this. Do they even have a duty to implement real endgame in End of Dragons? I would actually kind of argue yes. Look at the way that they handled Eye of the North and implementing grind there for those who were in the community during that time. But let's see. So tell me anything you want in terms of endgame systems that doesn't just have to be PvE, but primarily let's talk about that. Because yeah, I think people are unsatisfied in a lot of ways, and End of Dragons really could use a bullet point on its list of selling features, right? That is something endgame related. Which ball do they pick up and run with? Raids, fractals, dungeons, strikes, something new again? Let me know. Thanks, guys. Don't forget about all the guild stuff. The link in the description to Discord. I'm not just saying this because it's like a routine. I'm saying it because I really want you guys to think about it and consider it. Look at the links in the bottom. If you want to join the in-game guild, you'll probably have some good fun. We're actually growing at a good rate as well now that I've started mentioning it. So thank you to everyone for that, and hopefully you enjoyed this bonus episode or 2 in 1 day thing. Let's see how it does. Cheers, everyone. See you next time.